72 hours. That's all it took. One Iranian strike shattered the illusion of invincibility and turned Israeli cities into smoldering mirrors of Gaza. What followed wasn't just retaliation, it was transformation. The balance of power in the Middle East shifted in a flash, and nothing looks the same. It started with silence. Then, without warning, the sky over Israel split open. Not with thunder, but with fire, steel, and precision. Iran didn't just launch an attack, it executed a statement. A calculated, brutal, and technologically sophisticated strike that crippled the myth of absolute security. In less than an hour, key Israeli infrastructure, military bases, radar stations, communication hubs were turned to ash. These weren't random rockets. These were eyes in the sky, guided weapons, striking with mathematical perfection. Every launch spoke one message: we know where you are, and we know how to make you disappear. Command centers once thought impenetrable were vaporized. Power grids that fueled the heart of Israel's defense systems went dark. Entire neighborhoods that housed elite intelligence units were swallowed in coordinated blasts. Surveillance satellites were jammed. Airfields were cratered before a single jet could take off. Anti-missile batteries that once inspired confidence were engulfed in flames. The Iron Dome didn't collapse. It was bypassed, outsmarted, neutralized. Tel Aviv's skyline didn't just flicker, it fractured. Panic seized control rooms as generals stared at blinking red lights that meant one thing: operational failure. Israel's early warning systems, once hailed as a global model, were paralyzed. They never saw it coming, and when they did, it was too late. Hospitals lost power, military satellites went offline, critical data centers, buried beneath layers of steel and concrete, became two tombs of melted servers and smoke. This wasn't a show of force, it was a masterclass in modern warfare. Iran had spent years preparing for this exact moment. They knew the weak spots, they knew the overconfidence, they knew the illusion of invulnerability would be their greatest weapon. And they used it, brilliantly, ruthlessly, without hesitation. No boots on the ground, no need. The missiles did the walking, the drones did the talking. And the silence afterwards screamed the loudest. Israeli jets scrambled to respond. But from where? Runways were split open like dry earth. Hangars that held multi-million-dollar aircraft were reduced to flaming shells. Communication towers lay in twisted heaps. Command networks were splintered, forcing officers to use burner phones and handwritten orders. This was not just destruction, it was strategic decapitation. A nation built on high-tech defense was momentarily thrown back into analog chaos. What shook the world wasn't just the damage, it was the message: even the most fortified can bleed. Iran didn't just land a punch, they shattered the armor. And in doing so, they exposed a terrifying truth for every nation watching. This wasn't just about Israel. This was a demonstration of how modern warfare has changed forever. The battlefield is no longer at the border. It's in the power grids, the satellite feeds, the airwaves. And in 72 hours, Iran made it brutally clear: precision is more powerful than size. Speed is deadlier than strength. And when the first blow is also the last, you don't get a second chance. Retaliation came like a tidal wave of fury, but it wasn't clean, it wasn't surgical. It was apocalyptic. Entire neighborhoods vanished in seconds, buried beneath screaming skies and collapsing concrete. Missiles rained down like a curse, without pause, without mercy, igniting one firestorm after another. Israel responded with full-scale force, unleashing its arsenal into the heart of enemy territory. But it wasn't just Hamas or Hezbollah on the receiving end this time. It was Tehran's proxies, supply routes, covert bunkers, and even suspected launch zones buried under civilian structures. No distinction, no hesitation, just annihilation. Cities became war zones, streets that once echoed with sirens' laughter now echo sirens, smoke, and cries for help. The retaliation wasn't just military, it was total. Apartment blocks crumbled into powder. Schools turned to mass graves. Hospitals overflowed with the dead before they could treat the wounded. The ground shook not from natural disasters, but from man, made fury unleashed without restraint. Gaza looked like hell. Then Tel Aviv began to match it. Then Haifa. Then Ashkelon. Flame for flame. Ruin for ruin. The destruction didn't care who started it. It just kept spreading. This wasn't war. It was collapse. The rhythm of civilization halted. No electricity, no water, no internet. Just ash and rage. Firefighters had no roads to reach the flames. Ambulances had no fuel, no routes, no time. Families were trapped beneath rubble, and even the silence between explosions felt dangerous. Too quiet, too final. The sky, once a symbol of divine promise, now belonged to death machines. Drones buzzed overhead like vultures, waiting to finish what the first wave didn't. The retaliation triggered chaos that went far beyond borders. Lebanon ignited, Syria flared. Even Jordan began to stir. The entire region was sucked into the vacuum of violence, pulled into a spiral no one could stop. Countries once silent began choosing sides. Old wounds tore open. New alliances fractured in real time. The world held its breath, but the region exhaled in smoke. The retaliation didn't just respond. It escalated everything. The air was poison. The ground was glass. Survivors didn't look like people anymore. They looked like shadows walking through nightmares. Entire families lost in seconds. Generations wiped out between sunrise and sunset. Precision turned to punishment. Military targets were replaced by symbols. Television stations, religious centers, even refugee camps. Nothing was spared. This wasn't about strategy anymore. This was about pain. Diplomats screamed for ceasefires, but the missiles drowned their words. United Nations convoys turned back. Journalists disappeared. Civilians had no escape because every road looked the same. Dust, blood, fire. The retaliation wasn't measured. It was biblical. And as each building fell, so did the boundaries of morality, legality, and sanity. Nobody knew who struck last because the next strike always came faster. One hit turned into 10. 10 became hundreds. The death toll didn't climb. It soared. Vengeance had no face, no name, no end. What began as a response became a redefinition of destruction. And in just days, Israel no longer stood above the rubble. It stood inside it. The Iron Dome was built to be the shield of a nation, a technological marvel that promised safety from the skies. But in those first terrifying hours, that promise was shattered. Waves of missiles descended not in dozens, but in hundreds, in patterns designed to confuse, to overwhelm, to break the rhythm of interception. The system wasn't defeated by brute strength. It was outmaneuvered. Saturation was the weapon, and it worked. Alarms screamed, but not every scream ended in safety. People ran for cover only to meet explosions where they thought protection waited. What once inspired confidence now inspired fear. Citizens looked up, not to see a shield, but to watch the gaps widen. They saw the unthinkable, missiles slipping through, bypassing defense, crashing into homes, markets, highways. The dome didn't fall. It simply couldn't keep up. It was never designed for this scale, this speed, this storm. Its radars blinked in panic. Its batteries overheated. Its calculations lagged. And in that lag, lives were lost. Israel had long trusted the dome as its invisible armor, but armor cracks under pressure, and that pressure came in relentless waves. Coordinated salvos came from every direction, launched not just from Gaza, but from the north, from the sea, from sleeper cells hidden in plain sight. The system had to choose which missiles to stop and which ones to let hit. That's not defense, that's triage, that's war math. And war math is always paid for in blood. Children watched fire fall from the sky as if it were normal. Parents pulled their families into shelters that felt more like coffins. The rhythm of Israeli life, sirens, sprint, explosion, became the new heartbeat of the nation. But this time, the shield faltered. People whispered what they never dared say out loud. We are vulnerable. And that single thought spread faster than the rockets ever could. Every successful hit that bypassed the dome sent a shockwave, not just physically, but psychologically. If the shield can't protect us, what will? That question haunted every hallway, every command post, every sleepless night. The enemy didn't just aim to kill bodies, they aimed to crush morale. And every failure of interception was a loud reminder that no technology, no matter how advanced, can promise perfect safety. Global militaries watched in horror and fascination. The one system they studied, admired, replicated, was buckling. If it can happen here, it can happen anywhere. The message was chilling and clear. Air superiority is an illusion if saturation is the strategy. The dome never stopped fighting, but it stopped winning. And in that shift, the entire landscape of modern defense changed. It wasn't a question of design flaw, it was a shift in warfare. Offense evolved faster than defense. The shield belonged to yesterday, the storm belonged to now. And as the sky continued to rain destruction, the Iron Dome, once a symbol of resilience, now stood as a monument to the brutal reality that no system is invincible when the enemy decides to rewrite the rules. The line between soldier and civilian disappeared in a single night. Families who once watched war from a distance were now trapped inside it. The streets of Israel, once orderly and alive, turned into ghost corridors choked with smoke and silence. Homes became bunkers, and then those bunkers became graves. The faces of war were no longer only in uniform. They were mothers holding infants beneath crumbling ceilings, elders praying for the ground to stop shaking, children blinking through dust and blood. Gaza was no longer alone in its suffering. Israel, for the first time in a generation, felt the sting of urban collapse. Supermarkets emptied in hours, not from panic buying, but because the supply trucks never arrived. Gas stations ran dry as civilians flooded highways, only to find those roads blocked by debris, abandoned cars, or fresh impact craters. GPS failed, cell towers dropped. The normal pathways of life were erased, replaced by confusion and raw survival. Families that had lived in the same homes for decades were forced to flee without a destination, without a plan, just the primal urge to run from fire. The concept of home dissolved. Hospitals overflowed with bodies, not only from injury, but from the sheer shock of what the human mind can't process. People arrived burned, dismembered, hysterical. Many of them untouched by shrapnel, but shattered by the loss of everything familiar. Medical staff slept in hallways, eating rations meant for patients, surrounded by the hum of failing generators. Supplies dwindled, blood ran out. Morphine became sacred, and outside the hospital walls, the sound of airstrikes returned like a drumbeat of death. The humanitarian crisis didn't wait for permission. It erupted like a storm with no warning. Refugee camps sprang up inside stadiums, in synagogues, in office basements. People once proud, once powerful, now lined up in silence for bottled water, for stale bread, for blankets passed down by overwhelmed volunteers. The cries weren't just from children, they were from fathers who couldn't protect their families, from women cradling the remains of their past lives, from young men staring at the horizon with nothing left to believe in. Aid workers called it unprecedented, but the truth is more brutal. It was preventable. The arrogance of invincibility had delayed preparation. Now the price was being paid in real time. International agencies tried to send help, but the airspace was hostile, the roads impassable, the politics poisoned. Civilians became bargaining chips. Entire towns were marked as red zones, cut off from help, surrounded by fire and fear. Journalists captured images that no broadcast could soften, schools filled with bodies, elderly clinging to photos of vanished sons, babies covered in ash. And in every frame, one truth stood naked. This wasn't collateral damage. This was transformation. Israel, in trying to contain chaos, had become engulfed by it. The urban collapse wasn't a side effect. It was the new center. And every day the crises grew, not from failure to fight, but from forgetting that no wall, no missile, No doctrine can stop the wrath of war once it spills beyond the battlefield and into the homes of the living. The global stage turned cold when the missiles fell, but not silent. In the shadows of diplomacy, something darker moved. Alliances shifted like tectonic plates beneath the cracking world order. Within hours of the Iranian strike, long dormant enemies found common cause and former allies hesitated. The West didn't speak with one voice. It murmured, fragmented, calculating. The so-called unity unraveled under the weight of fear and ambition. Russia praised the balance of power being restored. China warned against interference but deepened military cooperation with Iran. The language of restraint was dead, replaced by coded threats and double meanings. Sanctions were issued like confetti, but they rang hollow as oil markets spiraled and currencies bled. No nation dared take full responsibility, yet every intelligence network leaked conflicting reports. Every foreign minister delivered polished statements laced with venom. Closed doors, generals updated strike plans, war game simulations shifted from hypothetical to imminent. The world didn't just watch, it realigned. NATO's foundations trembled as members split between escalation and caution. The UN became a theater of paralysis, words bouncing off walls stained by irrelevance. In Arab capitals, leaders met in emergency sessions, not to condemn, but to recalculate. Some called it justice, others whispered of opportunity. The normalization deals were frozen overnight. Embassies went dark. Military bases doubled their alert status. Israel found itself surrounded not just geographically, but diplomatically. Traditional friends offered statements, not support. There was no rush to assist, no surge of solidarity. The narrative had changed. The victim had become the accused in eyes that remembered decades of occupation, blockades, and brutality. Iran, once feared for its unpredictability, became admired for its precision. The strike wasn't just an attack. It was a declaration that the balance of deterrence had shattered. And in that declaration, Iran earned silent nods from populations that had long burned with resentment. Protests erupted not against Iran, but in support of its boldness. From Istanbul to Jakarta, voices rose not in horror, but in admiration. The streets of Western cities filled with outrage, not for the victims, but against the system that allowed the conflict to boil unchecked for generations. And as Israel struggled to respond, its isolation deepened. It wasn't just about weapons, it was about perception. The world no longer viewed Israel as the David. It now saw a Goliath exposed, vulnerable, and defiant. Global corporations pulled investments. Airline routes vanished. Hackers breached power grids and public systems. Sympathy became scarce. Skepticism soared. The world's opinion had pivoted, not by chance, but by a single successful strike that shattered the illusion of invulnerability. In the intelligence communities of Washington, Paris, Berlin, there was no celebration, only panic. The era of one-sided dominance was over. The balance had tipped, and no one could predict how far it would fall. Israel, for the first time in modern memory, found itself facing not just enemies with rockets, but a world where support had turned to silence, and silence to something more dangerous: indifference. And now you understand. The unimaginable has already begun. The walls that once protected have crumbled. The alliances that once stood firm have fractured. The myths of superiority have turned to dust. What you've just heard isn't a prediction. It's a reality unraveling before your very eyes. If this shook something inside you, don't stay silent. Like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts. And most importantly, subscribe right now, because what's coming next will change everything you thought you knew about power, war, and survival.